All right, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today, huh? Abortion and the Bible. We've got excerpts here from the Skeptics Annotated Bible, Rational Wiki, and even a site called evilbible.com. Should be interesting.
Yeah, talk about a range of perspectives, right? We're going from questioning traditional interpretations with the Skeptics Annotated Bible to, well, I'm not sure what to expect from a website called evilbible.com, to be honest.
And then you've got Rational Wiki in there too, which always seems to take this broader approach. I'm kind of curious to see how they tackle this whole thing.
Me too. It's like each of these sources is coming at it with a totally different lens. It's going to be fascinating to see how they lined up or maybe completely clash.
Okay, so jumping in, when we think Bible and abortion, what are some of those verses that immediately come to mind? For me, it's those ones about life beginning at conception, you know?
Oh, absolutely. You've got those go-to verses like Psalm 22.10, where it says, "Thou art my God from my mother's belly," or Jeremiah 1.5, where God's saying, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee." Those are powerful images, right?
Yeah, they really paint this picture of like divine recognition even in the womb. But then the Skeptics Annotated Bible comes in and kind of throws a wrench in
Oh,
things.
yeah. Like what?
Well, they bring up Exodus 21.22, where there's this situation describing a pregnant woman getting injured, and she ends up having a miscarriage because of it, and the punishment, a fine, like it's property damage, not the loss of a person,
Wow. That really makes you think about how differently the concept of life might have been viewed back then, doesn't it?
for sure. And it doesn't stop there. The Skeptics Annotated Bible goes on to talk about this thing called the bitter water ritual in Numbers 5.1131. Without getting into the nitty-gritty, it basically suggests that there might be situations where abortion is actually divinely condoned.
Whoa. Talk about a plot twist. That seems to contradict those other verses we were just talking about.
Right, it's like, what's the deal here? And it gets even wilder. There are actually passages where God seems to be directly involved in causing abortions or even infanticide.
Wait, really? Which verses are those?
Well, there's Hosea 9.116, where God's talking about how he will slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. And then there's Numbers 31.17, where Moses tells the Israelites to kill all the Midianite men and any woman who's been with a man, which, you know.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's pretty heavy stuff.
Right. And we're not even getting into those stories like King David and Bathsheba, where their first child dies because of David's sin.
Hmm.
I mean, how do you even begin to reconcile those kinds of stories with the idea of a merciful God who values all life?
It's a lot to unpack. One thing that's super important to remember, though, is the historical context of all of this. We're talking about texts that were written thousands of years ago in a totally different cultural landscape than what we're living in now.
It's like trying to use a map from the horse and buggy era to navigate a freeway.
Right, exactly. So trying to apply these ancient laws and stories to something as complex as abortion today, it requires a lot of careful consideration.
Definitely makes you realize that there's not always a black and white answer. Speaking of which, that's something that Rational Weki really seems to emphasize, is it like looking at the bigger picture.
Totally. One of the first things they point out is that abortion isn't some new concept that just popped up. It's been practiced across cultures for centuries. And then they go on to debunk some of those wild claims that are out
Oh
there.
yeah, like the whole thing about aborted fetuses being used in vaccines and food.
Exactly. Where do people even come up with that stuff? Rational Wiki really breaks down the science behind those claims and shows how they're just completely baseless.
It's like saying because my great-grandmother used bricks to build her house, that my morning toast must be made of bricks too. It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. And the thing is, these kinds of claims can actually be really harmful because they prey on people's fears.
Especially when it comes to something like vaccines, where people have to make important medical decisions. It's just irresponsible to spread that kind of misinformation. It really makes you realize how important it is to be critical of what you see online. You can't just believe everything you read, especially when it comes to something as important as, public health.
Hmm.
But okay, we've talked a bit about those claims that Rational Wiki debunks, but what about those verses that people often use to argue against abortion? What does the Skeptics Annotated Bible have to say about those?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, those are the verses that often come up in these debates, right? So how do they hold up under scrutiny? Well, the Skeptics Annotated Bible actually dives into those pro-life verses, and, well, let's just say it's not always as clear-cut as some people might think.
Really? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take Psalm 139.13, for instance. It's a beautifully written passage. "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb." That's definitely a powerful image, right?
Yeah, it really emphasizes the miracle of creation.
Exactly. But does it explicitly condemn abortion? Not really. I mean, it focuses on the wonder of how God forms a person, but it doesn't actually define when that personhood begins. And that's kind of the crux of the whole debate, isn't it?
So it's more about celebrating the process of life developing rather than making a statement about the legal or moral status of a fetus.
Right. And then there's that other verse that often gets thrown around, Psalm 22:10, "Thou art my God from my mother's belly." A lot of pro-life advocates point to that as evidence that life begins at conception. Like, there's already this relationship with God established in the womb.
Yeah, I can see how people would interpret it that way.
And it's not totally off base. But again, the Skeptic's Annotated Bible encourages us to look at the context. Like, this could just be a poetic way of expressing lifelong devotion to God. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a fully developed consciousness present at that stage. Think of it like saying, I've loved you since before I could even talk.
Yeah, it doesn't mean you understood all the complexities of love as a baby, right?
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
just a figure of speech. It's amazing how much meaning people can find in these verses, though, right? And how different those interpretations can be.
It's almost like everyone brings their own pre-existing beliefs to the text, and that shapes how they read it.
100%. It's like those optical illusion pictures, same image, but some people see one thing while others see something totally different. And speaking of different perspectives, we should probably get to evilbible.com because they've got a, shall we say, unique take on all of this.
Yeah, unique is one way to put it. It seems like they're less interested in subtle interpretation and more about shining a spotlight on those verses that paint a pretty harsh picture, to say the least.
It's like they're saying, if you want to talk about the God of the Bible and abortion, then let's talk about this.
And the this they're referring to is, well, it's pretty intense.
To put it mildly, for instance, they bring up Hosea 13:1, where God says, Samaria shall become desolate, their infants shall be dashed in pieces, and their women with child shall be ripped up.
Yikes. That's not exactly something you'd see on a Hallmark card. It's hard to reconcile those words with the idea of a loving and merciful God, isn't it?
That's exactly their point. They're saying that this whole pro-life interpretation of the Bible doesn't quite line up when you look at verses like that.
It's definitely a provocative way to get people thinking.
For sure, and they don't stop there. Evilbible.com goes on to list numerous instances of infanticide within the Bible, stories that are really hard to stomach.
Like the story of Jephthah, who sacrifices his own daughter to God, or the killing of all those firstborn sons in Egypt. Yeah, those are definitely not feel-good stories.
Not at all. And evilbible.com uses these examples to argue that the Bible's stance on taking innocent lives isn't as clear-cut as some people might believe. It's definitely a controversial approach, but it does make you think.
It does. And, even though all three of these sources come from completely different angles, they all seem to agree on one thing. This whole issue is incredibly complex, and trying to simplify it down to a black and white debate just doesn't do it justice.
Exactly. There are so many layers to it, the historical context, the centuries of interpretation, and of course, the deeply personal reasons why someone might choose to have an abortion. And Rational Wiki does a really great job of highlighting those personal reasons.
Right. They remind us that for a lot of people, this isn't just some theoretical debate. These are real-life situations with real-life consequences.
Absolutely. They talk about things like financial struggles, health concerns for the mother or the fetus, even pressure from partners or family members. These are huge decisions that people are making, often under incredibly difficult circumstances.
It definitely humanizes the whole issue. It's a good reminder that there are real people behind these choices, each with their own story to tell. It's easy to get caught up in the arguments and forget that there are actual human beings grappling with these decisions.
Absolutely. It's so important to remember that.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about ancient verses, modern myths, and everything in between. So as we kind of wrap things up here, what's your biggest takeaway from all of this? What really stuck with you?
For me, it's just the sheer complexity of this whole debate. I mean, it's so easy to get pulled into this back and forth, citing verses or statistics and trying to win the argument. But honestly, there's no easy answer here.
Yeah, it's not a simple equation, is it?
Not at all. The Bible, with all its different voices and, the historical context, it doesn't give us a clear-cut, one-size-fits-all answer. And trying to force it to do that, I don't know, it just feels like we're missing the point somehow.
It's almost like the more we try to simplify it, the further we get from really understanding it. You know what I mean?
100%. I think the real wisdom comes from recognizing the nuance, the gray areas, and just acknowledging that these are deeply personal decisions.
And that we can disagree respectfully, even on something as emotionally charged as this.
Exactly.
Well said. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. This has been quite the deep dive, and I've got to say, I've learned a lot.
Me too. And you know what? We've been focusing mainly on the Judeo-Christian perspective here, but it makes you wonder, how do other religions and cultures view this? What kind of lenses do they use to understand abortion?
It's a whole other layer to this conversation, isn't it?
Totally. And I think it's a really important one to explore.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, keep those questions coming, keep those conversations going, and keep exploring those different perspectives.